The message today is going to finalize the story of Lot in Scripture. This essentially is Lot's last appearance in the words of the Bible. And spoiler alert, it is not a positive final appearance for Lot. We saw last week he was kind of a mixed bag of obedience when those angelic rescuers showed up to deliver him from Sodom. He showed how much his surrounding culture had really changed him. He was so hesitant to leave, even in the face of this impending doom. They had to grasp his hand to help him out. And so now, as the dust of Sodom has settled, we see a man in today's passage who I think could be described as depressed, as dejected, and as alone, really. Even though he has his daughters with him, he's clearly to the point where he feels alone. So let's finish up Genesis chapter 19. I'll be starting in verse 30 and reading through verse 38. Lot and his 2 daughters left Zoar and settled in the mountains, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. He and his 2 daughters lived in a cave. One day the older daughter said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is no man around here to give us children, as is the custom all over the earth. So let's get our father to drink wine, and then sleep with him and preserve our family line through our father." So that night they got their father to drink wine, and the older daughter went in and slept with him, and he was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up. The next day the older daughter said to the younger, "Last night I slept with my father, so let's get him to drink wine again tonight, and you go in and sleep with him so we can preserve our family line together through our father." And so they got their father to drink wine, so that night also, and the younger daughter went in and she slept with him, and again he was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up. So both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter had a son, and she named him Moab, and he's the father of the Moabites today. The younger daughter also had a son, and she named him Ben-Ami, and he is the father of the Ammonites of today. So if I were to make a list of the top passages I would just randomly select if given the opportunity to preach somewhere, this would not be high on my list of choices. Last week was tough enough, and then this week, chapter 19 of Genesis is just one of those chapters you just kind of shake your head and go, wow. But I studied this week thinking, God, is there still something for us to learn here? Is there some reason that this remains here for us to squeeze some meaning out of? And thankfully, and I hope by the end you'll agree with me today, that there's much here actually to learn about not only this situation, but about our own lives, our own selves even today. So let's dig right in with just the obvious beginning of the story, that it was a short stay in this city of Zoar. Remember, Abraham is watching from distance. Lot was so hesitant to leave Sodom, just pleading, wanting to stay. And then he eventually, when he realized he would not be able to stay, and he didn't think he could make it to the mountains, he said to the angels, "Just let me go to Zoar." And multiple times he says, "It's just a small city, right? It's just little." Essentially saying it can't be as bad as Sodom. Just let me go to this small town life. And so they honor his request, and they allow him to go to Zoar. But we learn from the text today that it is probably a relatively short stay. We don't know how long exactly. We're not given a timeline or a timetable for how long Lot and his daughter stayed in that small town of Zoar. But because it butts right up against the end of last week, we have to assume it was not a very long time before they left Zoar. And did you notice why they left, we're told? Because Lot was afraid. Lot was afraid to stay in this small town that he had earlier begged to get to flee into. Strange, isn't it? So I found myself thinking at the beginning of the story as I'm studying, why would Lot be afraid, so afraid he felt the need to leave the city of Zoar. A couple of ideas that sort of sprang to my head based on Lot's character and the flow of the narrative so far. First of all, maybe it's true that he didn't really trust the word of the angels that this place was safe. I mean, it was kind of a last-minute compromise where Lot said, I can't make it to the mountains, let me go to this small city over here. And the angels, knowing that the time is ticking on Sodom, said, fine, just go there. Have you ever been in that situation where you're desperate to get somebody, just leave me alone, just go. Do it with our kids all the time. Not all the time. Sometimes, right? Sometimes. So, fine, go find somebody to play with in the neighborhood. I don't care. Come back whenever you want. No, but when we look back on those situations, maybe Lot looked back and went, is this really a safe place to be? Because that was kind of a last-minute agreement that I had with those angels. Maybe that was part of it. Or maybe, perhaps, Lot arrived in Zoar and realized, wow, this looks really similar to Sodom. Because don't forget, this is another one of those cities on the plain, and if you look back at the story we looked at last week, it seems as though the angels may have at least been considering destroying this city as well. And so I wonder if Lot arrived and went, this doesn't look much different than what I just left behind, and I know what happened back there. So why would I want to stick around? Or maybe, possibly, Lot arrived in Zoar, and the people there, we're told multiple times it's a small town, and you know in small town life, everybody knows everybody, right? Matter of fact, in some small towns, including the one in which I grew up, it seems like everybody not only knows everybody, but is related to everybody. And so I wonder if Lot showed up in Zoar, the small town, and they kind of said, hey, stranger, you're not from around here, are you? Where are you from? And if they find out that he's from Sodom, I wonder if they go, we saw what happened, and we don't have any interest in that making its way to our city. And maybe they treated him poorly because of what they were afraid he would bring with him into their community. We don't know. Those are all possibilities, but for whatever reason, Lot felt fearful enough in Zoar that he thought, I cannot stay here, I need to go. And he actually ends up going to the place he originally said he couldn't get to. He goes to the mountains, but not just to the mountains, to live in a cave. He's afraid, he's lost everything, he has nowhere else to turn, except this week I'm thinking about, why not go back to Abraham at this point? You've lost everything. You have no one else to turn to. But instead of going back to Uncle Abe, he says, no, I'll go to the woods and live in a cave. I'll tell you what that speaks to me, friends. That speaks to me of a tremendous amount of pride that wouldn't let him go back and say to Uncle Abraham, can you please take me back? It reminds me of the prodigal son, except he does the opposite and just goes the other direction instead of going back and humbling himself. And so here he is living in the mountains in a cave. And before we examine what actually happens in the cave and make judgments about Lot and his daughters and things like that, let's pause for a moment and remember the tremendous amount of loss that Lot has experienced that led him to this cave in the first place. I would submit to you today that Lot has lost nearly everything he's ever loved. He's lost nearly everything that he has ever loved. I mean, let's start with this first. Since parting ways with Abraham, Lot has longingly looked for acceptance within that cosmopolitan life among those cities on the plain. You remember the scene when Lot and Abraham agree, we can't stay together. The land can't sustain so many flocks and herds. We need to separate. And Lot looked in distance and saw, oh, the life in the city. We talked about how he's been following Abraham around for who knows how long, living this nomadic lifestyle, picking up the tent, moving along, putting it down again, only interacting with people really in the immediate family and the servants. And he looks at the city and goes, that's the life. That's what I want to be accepted in the hustle, the bustle, the cosmopolitan feel of being in a place like that. As soon as he left Abraham, he pursued Sodom. He went in that direction. Then we read that he pitched his tent near Sodom. He lived in the burbs for a while, on the outskirts of Sodom. But then eventually we read in the text that he was found to be living in Sodom itself. He so desperately wants to be loved and accepted by this city and this city life that even after what's essentially a prisoner of war experience, instead of staying with Abraham, he goes back to Sodom again. Remember, he was carried away, just like the other people and possessions of Sodom. And I'm wondering as I'm reading the text again this week, wondering, did Lot go back to Sodom because potentially, I'm thinking his stock rose a little bit because the people of Sodom know who rescued them, and it's Lot's uncle. Does that make Lot even a little bit more important in the eyes of the people from that city? I don't know. But for whatever reason, even after being a prisoner of war, he didn't think that may not be a safe place to go back to. He went back anyway. And his dream of being accepted and loved by that city and the city life looks like it was so close to becoming reality when those angelic visitors came, because we find Lot in the city square, just inside the gate, during the evening time, which is where they would have had the meetings of the most influential people of the city. People who hear arguments and cases and adjudicate them. So Lot, he's right there on the edge. If he's not in the inner circle, he's just on the outside of it. But not anymore. That dream is over because the city is gone. The small town compromise is now done. He's far from the glamorous good life that he envisions as he looked from far off and saw those cities on the plain. And not only is he outside of city life, he's in the mountains. Not only in the mountains, he's living in a lonely, dark, dank cave. So he lost that. But he lost so much more than that, right? When he escaped the city of Sodom, he was not able to bring any possessions with him. No flocks, no herds, all of that wealth that he had accumulated while he was with Abraham. And he took with him to the city. How much of it did he bring with him as Sodom was destroyed? None of it. So he's lost that as well. And let's not forget this really, really important point that sometimes gets lost between these two stories. As they were on the edge of leaving Sodom, who did Lot lose? His wife. Essentially, he saw his wife, vaporized, because she was even less willing to let go of Sodom than he was, looking back, longing for it. And if you have ever lost a spouse, or you've walked with someone who has lost a spouse, you know what that does. Lot, it seems, has lost everything that he loved. And grief can do crazy things to people. When we lose something we love, let alone most things we love, grief can do crazy things to us. And in Lot's instance, it led him to the abuse of alcohol so badly that he had these really twisted sexual scenes with his daughters, not once but twice. It reminded me of this truth. If we can't or won't deal with our grief and our pain, we will look for some form of escape. We will. If we can't deal with what we've lost or the pain of life, things like that, we will look for an escape. And if you doubt that that's true, you need look no further than our community and our state and our country, because we are in the midst of an opioid crisis that is unbelievably bad. And if you think it's just out there somewhere, you are wrong. And I believe that at least one reason people turn to that is because they cannot deal with the hurt, the loss, the pain of life, and so they turn to that instead. We will look for an escape of some kind if we can't deal with the pain, the hurt, and the loss, and the grief in life. When grief and fear collide, disaster often follows, and that's what happens in this cave of shame. And that leads us to the next question that I ask myself and I want to unpack this morning. Why would Lot's daughters conspire to use him in such a shameful manner? What led them to hatch a plot like the one that they hatched in that cave? And I have a couple of suggestions, and as we go through these, what I want you to think about is how we may see that here in this story, but then more importantly, do we still see this in our lives today? Because I think that we do. Here's the first one. Expectations. A couple times in the text it says that those daughters were just intent on preserving the family line. There were heavy expectations in ancient times for those women to continue the family line. It was of paramount importance. If you were a female, it was job numero uno. That was what you existed to do, mostly, was forward the family line. And so I can't help but wonder if they felt the weight of those expectations. That's what made you worthy of being a woman, and celebrated as a woman in their culture was your ability to maintain the family line. That's why when you read stories of childlessness in the Old Testament, there's so much drama and emotion there, because those women were not fulfilling the expectations that were laid upon them. I wonder if while they were thinking about those expectations, they basically asked this question: is it more shameful to produce no children at all than it would be to produce some children by questionable means? And obviously they decided that it would be more shameful to not continue the family line than to do anything even remotely possible to continue the heritage of their family. It's this classic case of doing the right thing for the wrong reasons, right? It was honorable for them to want to serve their families and their community by continuing this family line, but they are going about it in a way that is wrong. They knew it was wrong. If it was something that was perfectly acceptable to them, they would have not needed to get their father to drink so much wine that he didn't know who he was or what he was doing. But because of the heavy expectations that were laid upon them, they made these desperate decisions. Not only expectations, but I would say fear of the future. You have two young women living in a cave looking around going, well, our father's very old. And if our father dies and we are here in this cave, guess who will be around to provide for us? No one. And again, this is a different time, a different culture. If they did not have a son or an uncle or a brother, and there's no one. So I would imagine they feared a future where Lot dies and they have no one. Because in their culture and in their time, if you were someone who had no male to provide for you, whether it's husband, uncle, brother, son, whatever it might be, many times you would turn to selling your own body to simply survive. And so I look at this story and wonder, maybe they thought, better take one chance of this one questionable sexual exchange than to risk the entire rest of my life selling my body to men in order to survive. Because what does the future look like if our father dies and there's no one to care for us? Another possibility is comparison. Did you notice in the text they say, listen, there's no one around here to give us sons, as is the custom all over the earth. Essentially saying everybody else has this, but I don't. Everybody else all over the planet has this, but I don't have this. And I think one way, to step into the realm of application for just a second, one way this still applies to our lives today, I think that it's a big reason for the tremendous amount of crushing debt that we have in our world. Because we look at something and we go, everybody else has this. Don't I deserve this? Everybody else, the custom of the earth is this, to have this. So why don't I deserve to have this as well? Comparison can lead us to make desperate decisions. Another one might be cultural influence. I can't believe that these daughters maybe weren't affected at least a little bit by the culture in which they grew up in Sodom. And so, they look at this opportunity with their father maybe differently, because we know the story of Sodom, and the boundaries on sexuality were pretty rare, maybe even non-existent. So maybe the way that they were affected by the culture that shaped them plays a part in this story. Or lastly, and I think this is one of the most powerful ones of all, I would call it rightful revenge, although rightful will be in air quotes because revenge is never a good idea. But let's not forget a key point of the previous episode. When those angels came to rescue them and the men were outside pounding the door down, essentially trying to break it down, what was Lot's solution for a compromise? No, my friends, don't do this evil thing to the visitors here. Take my daughters and do whatever you want with them. And if you're Lot's daughter and you've heard him speak about you in that way, as if you're just a pawn in his game, as if you're merely a possession to be traded, or if maybe you're just worthless, then it shouldn't surprise us that when there's an opportunity for Lot to be used as if he's just a means to an end, that they take it upon themselves. Well, whatever their motivations are, the plan works, right? We read about them carrying out the plan, and we read that they both became pregnant, and that those pregnancies resulted in 2 births, and we're given the names of those boys who were born, Moab and Ben-Ami. And we look at that today and we go, so what? Other than the fact that we generally don't name children Moab and Ben-Ami today, although there are some crazy names out there these days, so there probably are a Moab out there too, I would imagine. But we look at that and we don't really make the connection I think that we need to make to fully understand what's happening in this passage, because those 2 men, Moab and Ben-Ami, were told in the text become the fathers of the Moabites and the Ammonites, which again doesn't mean a lot to us unless you start to understand the history of the people of Israel and the Old Testament, because guess what those two groups of people would end up doing? They would be thorns in the flesh of Abraham's descendants for generations. You'll find them listed in the stories that come along in Kings, Chronicles, and Judges. They're the people who surround the Israelite people and are prodding them, who are drawing them into wars and battles, maybe sometimes even enslaving them. And so how crazy is it that at the close of Lot's life, his final scene, the final act, the curtain drops, he essentially is in this compromised situation where he ends up fathering 2 groups of people who will be at war essentially with Abraham's people for generations to come. Man, unintended consequences. Desperate solutions to what I would call high-impact problems can lead to terrible, unforeseen, unintended consequences. When we make our decisions in desperation, and when we try to solve short-term problems with desperate solutions, we are setting ourselves up, or our next generations up, down the line for pain, much of the time. I mean, don't get me wrong, they solved their short-term problem. They had sons. Those sons then grew. Those sons could care for their mothers. They got the solution they wanted. They got provision, they got the continuance of a family line, but at what cost? Short-term solutions at what long-term cost, because they acted not in faith, not in hope, but in fear and in desperation. And it would be sad if that's the way the story ended, if that's sort of the stopping point. But what I learned this week, and this is fabulous to me, is that's actually not the end of this particular branch of the story. Here's why. If you read through the Old Testament prophets, especially Jeremiah, you will see these prophetic hopes and dreams that these people groups, Moabites, Ammonites, along with others, will somehow, someday, be reconciled and restored. And if you know Old Testament history, it's a crazy dream. That these people would somehow be reconciled and restored to the people of God, to the Israelite community. But do you know when it happened? Because it did. It happened in another story based on a woman named Ruth. Because do you remember where Ruth is from? Ruth is from Moab. And she marries a man named Boaz. And do you know where Boaz is from? From the tribe of Judah, from the people of Israel, of Abraham's descent. And do you know what that union eventually led to? To King David, the greatest king in the history of the Israelite people. And ultimately, where does David's line lead us to? To Jesus. I'm not going to get into some debate about what God caused and all these kinds of things. I just want to say it this way. What happened in that cave of shame was terrible, was disobedient on so many fronts, but God somehow, even in our deepest moments of shame, Whether we're the antagonist or maybe we're the survivor, God can overcome and even use those things, those times, for his purposes somehow. So if you have ever, or maybe you even recently have spent time in some sort of cave of shame, I want you to hear this today. That story is not over yet. Whether you have caused shame or whether you maybe have suffered shame, the story isn't over. Because if anybody knows about taking shame and laying it in a cave, it's Jesus. Because he took my sin and your sin, my shame and your shame, he took it into a cave called his tomb, and he laid it to rest. And so if anyone knows about the power to overcome those shameful moments or seasons of our lives, it's Jesus Christ, the one who has overcome and makes us into overcomers. So a few things to think about, to reflect on, so we can not just listen to the word today, but do what it says. Here's the first one. Have you suffered loss or grief in the recent weeks or months, or I would even add years, because grief takes a long time to get through? How have you handled it, and how can you change the way that you deal with it? Because if you don't deal with it in a healthy and in a Christ-centered way, you're going to look for those avenues of escape, and it's going to get ugly. Secondly, do any of Lot's daughters' potential motivations that we discussed, do any of those resonate with your experience? Heavy expectations or fear of the future, comparison or cultural influence, right for revenge, because they're from an ancient story, but guess what? They are alive and well today. Do any of those resonate with where you are or where you have been? Ask God to give you the strength to overcome them. And then lastly, pray for someone today who you know who may be inside a cave of shame right now, whether they're suffering shame or whether they are enacting shame. And can I just say this too? Can we pray for our nation today? Because I feel like we are walking through a cave of shame as a people, as a nation. Watching some of the words and the images and everything that came across my television, my phone, my devices, it's absolutely shameful, some of what's going on out there. And we need to be people of prayer who say, God, overcome that shame. Use this shameful moment to project us closer and closer to your kingdom's view of what this world is and should be. So take a moment or two if you want to pray, if you want to bow your head, you just want to read through those words on the screen, and then I'm going to close us with prayer in just a moment.